We have a ton of stuff to go over. So again, like we said, our main topics today are going to be editing and draw fusion. So again, all of those questions are definitely things we are going to jump into today. Like we said, you really do need DG16. The screens are going to look very different if you are in 15, and you may not have some of the features that we go over. So my suggestion is to definitely download DG16. Everyone here is entitled to that software, so it's nothing that you would be charged for. If you choose to stick with 15 though, I mean, again, like I said, you may be missing some things, and things may look very different to you on your software. So what we are going to be starting with is our outline editing. So again, if you remember, we discussed the outline files. Those are the files that your digitizers are creating from scratch. You may be doing it yourself. And the very first thing we want to look at is going to be the fabric compensation and what it is that was changing. So when you did your homework from part 1, our big push there was to get you to get something on the screen, put some lettering with it, get it to your machine and sew it. So again, that was a big task for somebody who's brand new. So we were having you use the recipes. So today what we want to go through is what is exactly in the recipes. And we've already said that the recipes themselves are going to be compensating for negative characteristics of different fabrics. So they are changing the primary stitch control factors, which are your density, your pull compensation, and your underlay. So we're going to go through each of those, and then we're going to go walk through where they're found and how to change them. So with density, again, my other big thing is that I'm going to say when we are discussing these is the assumption that I am making is that everyone here is working in inches. Again, if you aren't, there are charts that will translate metric into inches, so you can refer to that. But again, we are going to be discussing the software and those features based on inches, and in density speak, we are going to be looking at it in stitches per inch. So obviously that density is going to affect the outcome of your design. So like we said, density are those number of stitches filling in that design. When those stitches are increased, obviously the goal there is to stop you from seeing the fabric show through. When you start lessening your density, sometimes you're doing that because you have a lighter weight fabric. Sometimes you're doing that because you want to see fabric show through. So some of it is because we are just looking for a certain effect. Other times we have fabrics like thick fabrics, textured fabrics, that we find that when we sew on them, that they are causing an issue. We're starting to see that fabric, or there's something about it that is causing an issue when we sew out. So density is that first thing that we start to look at. There are 2 different settings for density. We have our master density and what we call the relative density. So as far as the master goes, it is not that you cannot change it. Again, it is preset for you. It's 63.5 stitches per inch. Again, some people are fine with that. I personally use that as my default density and work from there. I know other people have used other software, possibly you've used our software, and you have a different preference. That's fine. My suggestion to you is do not use that as the density you change on a regular basis. Because what you're going to find is that that master density is what everything else is looking to make changes. So if you do want to change your master density, that's fine. Go ahead and do that the one time, because the relative density is really where you're making daily changes based on your fabric type. So your relative density is the one that is found within a stitch type. So it's going to be found either in your satin path or it's going to be found in your complex fill based on what stitch you are looking to adjust. So when you're looking at the pictures we have off to the right-hand side here of the circles, that very first circle, the relative density is set for 0. Obviously, there are stitches in the object, so that doesn't mean that there are no density things happening. It just means that it's running 63.5 stitches per inch. So we're not adding or subtracting from the default. Now, if we go ahead and we put a minus 30 SPI in the relative density, what it's doing is it is subtracting that from the master. So in reality, what you've done is you have changed your density to 33.5 stitches per inch. So it is always looking to the master to know what it is adding or subtracting from. So the same thing, if you're adding, it's going to add to the master density. So this is why I'm saying it's not that you can't change the master, it's just that once you do it, stick to it, because it's always going to affect everything you do. So everything that you've done, everything you've possibly edited, you've set up, if you start messing with the master density, you're messing with all of that relative density when you bring a design up again. So the relative density, like we said, is always going to be found within a stitch type. So again, right now I happen to have a properties box up from a satin path. So like we said, density normally is set for 0.0 if nothing has been changed. So this is where you would either add or subtract. So again, you're going to put how much you want to add or subtract. Minus 10, minus 15. So whatever you're putting here, you're going to put it in that box for the density. Now, as far as what you're going to adjust and where, you're going to find that under that satin path tab, obviously designs that have satin path, you could adjust it there. Anything that is a steel stitch would also be adjusted under the satin path category, and probably about 99% of our text. Again, 99% of our fonts are digitized as a satin. So any of those fonts that are digitized as a satin would also be adjusted within that satin tab. Now, if you are using a complex fill in the design, or you have left your true type fonts as a complex fill, those would then be adjusted under the tab for a complex fill. So as far as when we're increasing on our heavier weight knits, again, your sweatshirts, your heavier weight PK polo shirts, again, things with the surface texture, so PK kind of gets hit both ways. PK does have a texture, sometimes it can be on the heavier side, so we're often increasing that. We are also increasing for our polar fleeces and our towels. Now, another one you may not have thought of is contrasting colors. And again, if you're new, you probably haven't seen this yet, but you're going to end up at one point just throwing something onto, let's say, black thread on a white garment, white thread on a black garment, and you're going to look at it and you're going to go, you know, I'm kind of seeing things bleed through here. So that's what we're talking about with that. It's not that necessarily the material calls for it, but because of the color contrast, then that's something that would need to be adjusted. So as far as when we decrease, again, we're decreasing when we have our non-wovens, like our leathers and suedes, our thin garments, like our silk, satins, and linens. And again, one that I throw in there personally are those tiny little thin t-shirts that all the kids are wearing. So again, those are really hard to sew on. And again, oftentimes you need to decrease your stitches on them. And I don't care what fabric you're sewing on. When you have small segments and thin columns, you can't pile density in there because again, it's not going to look nice. So anytime you have small segments and thin columns, I don't care if you're on a Carhartt jacket or not, you would still end up decreasing the stitches so that those are going to give you a nice sew out. Then our next one we want to look at is pull compensation. I know this one throws people a little bit, especially when they see it on the screen, because when you put a recipe on there, all the recipes have a pull compensation. There's not one that doesn't. So even something like woven, which technically doesn't have a real true stretch to it, you're still adding a little bit of pull compensation because, again, just the nature of fabric as you're stitching on it, it does pull in a little bit. So pull compensation 99% of the time is being increased because you are adjusting for the fact that when a stitch is formed, it's going to pull and make the stitches narrower. So you're usually overcompensating so that when that stitch is finished sewing, you're getting that width that you intended. So we really have two types of pull compensation. The original pull compensation is percentage. So again, that's the very first one we ever had in any of our systems. And that's based off of the original stitch length. So you would be adding, or again, you could possibly go down by percentage. So if I were to increase 110%, every stitch is going to be increased 10% of its actual length. That's great when everything is proportional. Where we were running into issues with our percentage pull compensation is when we started to have more advanced software and things were all one piece, but they were multiple widths. So when you have something that's multiple widths, again, kind of like the pictures we're showing here, if I were to put 110% there, 10% of that top value is totally different than 10% of the values towards the middle. So what you're going to find is that the majority of your recipes and pretty much all your digitizers are going to be using the newer of the two, which is your absolute pull compensation. So with absolute, it is applying a specific value across the board. So in this instance, we added 0.02 as our value. So every single stitch is increased 0.02. It doesn't matter what the original width was. Again, especially if you are looking at small lettering and thin columns. Again, in our Embroidery Essentials Part 1, we were saying that the smallest satin that we can sew is 0.04 inches. So if you had a design and you were trying to increase that so it was at least the minimum width to sew out as a satin, again, you'd be able to figure out, okay, I'm going to measure this on my screen, and let's say it is 0.03. Again, you can add 0.02 and it's going to give you the minimum plus a little bit so that it has room to pull. So that is your pull compensation. Our last primary stitch control factor that is helping you to build these nice quality designs is your underlay. So your underlay are those stitches that are sewing underneath your design. So if you stood in front of your machine and watched something sew, again, I'm sure everyone has because it's actually really cool to watch your machine sew. So what you're seeing as it starts to sew is this bunch of stitches that are coming down, and eventually they're covered up by what you see when you're looking at the finished product. So those initial stitches or foundation stitches are your underlay. So we're going to look at six different types of underlay. So the first one we want to look at is contour. That's our most basic underlay, and it's oftentimes combined with other ones. So when you see something combined, oftentimes contour is combined with another underlay type. So again, our contour is a running stitch. Some people are going to call it an edge walk. So that is going to be a stitch that is traveling close to the perimeter of your shape. So it's going to follow along. Its primary purpose is to tack the backing to the garment to prevent it from shifting. That is its main purpose in life. It's also going to act like a perimeter wall. So again, it's going to grab those contour stitches. So it's going to stop it from sinking into the fabric. Then we have our perpendicular underlay. Again, with our perpendicular underlay, it is again running stitches. They are traveling down the center of the column, and you do have control over the number of lines that it uses. It does default to 2 lines, but again, when you're doing your small lettering or thin columns, you may be taking that down to 1 line so that it's not going to hang out. So again, sometimes you see little loops on the edge of your design. That's a lot of times your underlay trying to poke out because the stitch is actually pulled in, but your underlay is sticking out. So if you go down to 1 line of underlay, then it's hopefully going to stay right down the center and not peek out on either side of the actual stitch. Then we come to our parallel. So with our parallel, it's actually a low density satin stitch, and it's going to give you lift off of the fabric. So that's going to help you out with your surface textures. Again, things like your PK polo shirts. It's also going to give you that color coverage that we were talking about. So when you have those contrasting thread and fabric colors, that parallel is going to help stop that bleed through effect. Then we get into our zigzag. So zigzag is a double parallel. So again, its goal is to flatten the pile of your fabric. So your pile on your fabric, for people that aren't familiar with those terms, if you're looking at your towel, you're looking at your polar fleece, you're looking at velvet, you've got, again, all of that, the loops on your towel, your polar fleece is kind of fluffy. What you're trying to do, and that's considered the nap of the fabric, is you're trying to flatten that so when the stitches go on, they're not trying to peek through. So you don't want those loops of your towel to peek through the top of your embroidery. So that zigzag is trapping all of that underneath. So it's giving you a nice smooth surface to sew on. Now with our lattice and our full lattice, the only time they are ever available is when you are doing a complex fill. And again, a lattice and a full lattice are equivalent to your parallel and your zigzag, and they do exactly the same thing. Now your lattice underlays will always run at a 45-degree angle to whatever the fill angle is. So they're always going to run at a 45. So again, the regular lattice is 1 pass. Again, it's to smooth out those surface textures and give you that color coverage. Then we also have a full lattice, which is a double. So again, it's 2 layers. And again, it's going to flatten all of that pile out on your towels, your polar fleece, and that kind of thing. So we are actually going to jump into our software and also answer a few questions that we see there and walk through where a lot of these things are. So let's go ahead and let's see where that went. So I'm going to open up that software again.